Why, hello there. I hope you're ready for conflicts. I know that I am ready to get the final over with and enjoy a break. So conflicts of law, for those that are not aware, is when there is kind of an argument, if you will, about what law should apply. Typically, when you have a case that's brought to court, you usually would assume the law where you filed would apply. That's not always true. And if there is conflicting law, then we have a problem, and we have to figure out, okay, how do we resolve this problem? And that's where the conflicts of law come into play. There's actually 3 different ways that you can resolve a conflicts of law issue. That's with what's known as the first restatement, the second restatement, or the governmental interest test. So there's 3 different ways, okay? Now, when you're looking between which one should apply, we'll get into that later. But just know, regardless of which one you are applying, there's going to be the same first few steps that you apply to every single test. And the last step you're always going to apply is going to be the same as well. And this is just kind of a framework that I created to try to make sure that I didn't forget anything in the analysis when it comes to the bar or when it comes to the test. I want to make sure that I had everything there in a way that was logical and that made sense to me, that I could understand. And so I created a method. I call it the EtonWay, and I thought it was super cute. You don't have to like it, you don't have to follow it, but it's what works for me and it makes a lot of sense to me. So, Eton, spelled E-T-O-N, way, W-A-Y, but the A's down here, I'll explain that in a second. So, well actually real quick, just so you all know, how did I get these letters? So I actually took the last letter of who, what, when, where, why, how, and I just adjusted the order. I thought if I tried to take it out of the typical order we all remember, it would be more confusing to remember in a different order. So that's why I came up with this, okay? So the E comes from the E in where, because that's the last letter. So the very first thing you should always ask on a conflicts of law essay issue is, where was the suit filed? You're like, why would I ask that? Because it helps you figure out the most important thing. Do they have jurisdiction? You can't ask if they have jurisdiction if it wasn't filed there, right? So typically the biggest thing you're going to ask is, where was it filed? So the first question is going to start with your little E in Eton. So the Eton way says, first ask, where was it filed? Because then you can get to jurisdiction and figure out, okay, do we have jurisdiction? The next one is T. T comes from the word what, because the last letter is the T in what. And what is very simple. The what is, what happened? That's it. What happened? So think most generally, right? Was it an accident? Was it a fraudulent claim? Did someone have a contract that they failed to perform? Was there a freak accident at a workplace? Like what happened? Okay? And the reason it's important to know what happened is because that will kind of help you guide yourself through the rest of your analysis to make sure you remember what the focus is. Okay, so what happened? Next one, O for who. And I like this one because I think it makes a lot of sense. So with who, what you're thinking about is, okay, whose law am I going to apply? Initially, because there's multiple levels and multiple layers of law. Think of law as an onion, right? So this layer is going to ask, okay, whose law am I going to apply? Is this a federal law thing or is this a state law thing? If 2 states are trying to figure out like what law applies, and it's pretty easy, you don't have to get into the depth about this. But if it's between a federal law and a state law, or there might be that issue, then you have to go into procedural versus substantive law. Explain that later, but that's what the who stands for. Now when, so you can admit this, some people don't use Renvoy, or some people don't want to consider internal or hold on because they usually don't use it. And the reason why is because it's very circular. So a lot of courts don't apply the Renvoy law because it makes it very circular, difficult to understand. But if you're going to include in your analysis like I have done, then you're going to ask yourself when. So the N stands for when. When does Renvoy apply? Renvoy typically is going to apply when you have more of a marital or divorce issue, okay? Now remember, Renvoy means that you apply the whole law, which is the choice of law rules plus substantive law. or technically internal law, but internal law is just substantive law. So if Renvoy does not apply, then you're just applying the internal law of a state, whereas if Renvoy does apply, then you're going to apply the whole law, which is their choice of law and their internal laws. We'll explain later what that is in depth more, but I always want to ask that, take it out of the way. Then after that, I'm going to go, how? How am I going to resolve this problem? How am I going to resolve this conflicts of law issue and whatever fact pattern I'm dealing with? Well, I have to ask myself, is this restatement, second restatement, or is this the governmental interest test? So how am I going to resolve it? I might resolve it with the first restatement. And then after I figure out which I'm going to apply, I'm going to say, because of blah, 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 the second restatement applies. Therefore, that will help determine the outcome. Then, after I determine the how, I go to EtonWay. The second to last letter is A. You could leave it out. I put it in, so technically it would still be helpful. A is analysis. I thought that was just funny. Obviously, the analysis for whatever you decide could fall under this part. But if you want it to be a little bit more broken apart and accurate, you can keep the A. So A is for the analysis. So what analysis are you going to do? Just follow whatever you determine choice of law applies. So for example, if it's the first restatement, it's super easy. It's the Lex Loci approach. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but that approach is really determinative of where something happens. That's very simplistic, but think of it like this. Anytime something happens in a specific location, that is going to be the law that governs. For the most part, again, very simplistic, but the analysis for that would have to discuss the Lex Loci, depending on the type of law, the field of law, and all that stuff. Now, the last one is why, for why, right? That's kind of funny, get it? So this one, I actually bundled up into two different things because I found it made the analysis more simplistic, and I'm really all about simplifying the steps so that first of all, I reduce redundancy, and second of all, I'm able to get everything I need to get done, and third of all, I'm able to give a very strong analytical framework that doesn't leave anything out. So this is why I did it this way. Totally don't have to. This is the way that I did it. So Y stands for why was or was not the outcome limited by constitutional limitations or by public policy. Now, constitutional limitation stands for what? It stands for did I say constitutional limitations? I did. It stands for due process and full faith and credit clause. We'll get into that later. And then obviously public policy. I think every single test has some exception that says this is the answer. However, if there's a public policy that the state has, or there is a fundamental policy of the nation, or there is a fundamental, natural law that says this, we will not hold this law to be accurate. We won't hold it to be valid. We won't enforce this law. Or this law is so completely egregious, there's no way in our good conscience we will enforce this law, or we will acknowledge this law, or acknowledge this event. So you can literally argue public policy for every single restatement and for the governmental interest test, and it comes up as an exception for every test somewhere. And so it's really great to leave it at the end because that first allows you to, one, argue in the alternative, which people love that, and two, and make sure you don't forget, because sometimes even if the law is very clear cut, that doesn't necessarily mean there's not a public policy issue, and it comes up with every single one. So it's best, since it applies to all of them, add it to your base framework. So this is the base framework. The only thing that's going to really change is your analysis depending on your how. So the EtonWay, that was kind of fun. Not the EtonWay. Don't do it the EtonWay. We know what happens if you do it that way. Just do it Eton's way, right? EtonWay. I can't think of anything, easier. But I thought that was very, very clever, and I'm pat on the back for myself. So remember, it's the last letter of every single who, what, when, where, why, how. So if you just write those all out and circle the last letter, maybe that will help you. I thought that was very helpful, so I wouldn't forget. But if it's easier to do steps, step one is, do we have jurisdiction in the first place, right? Can we even bring in a suit here? Can we use our power as courts to obligate these parties to do something? Next one is, what exactly happened here? What field of law is at play here? Whose law is at risk or is at issue, Or do we have a federal issue and a state issue, or two state issues? Do we have two federal issues? Very unlikely, right? It's usually going to be either completely state issue, totally fine, or you're going to have federal plus state issue, and that's where you get into the horizontal versus vertical analysis, which we'll get into later. And then obviously the fourth step would be which law would apply, or in this case, when would we apply the law of, say, you know, the Florida law. When will we apply Florida's law over New York law? So that's going to be arguing Renvoy. Do we use their internal law, or we use their internal law, or is it a whole law issue? Remember, if you're using whole law, it's a Renvoy issue called circular issues, circular problems. So if you don't want to use this step, technically you wouldn't have this many steps, you'd have one less. But if you keep this step, that was going to take you at step 4, is there any Renvoy issues? Step 5 is doing the first restatement, second restatement, or governmental interest test. And then obviously the last step would be if there's any limitations that are placed constitutionally or per public policy. So you can whittle it down to either 5 steps if you want. I have it as 6 steps, and I also number the individual steps for the restatements and the governmental interest just to make it easier for me. So that's kind of the method. If you don't like it, I'm so sorry. I thought it was great. I hope it helps. And I guess we're just going to have to now start breaking down EtonWay, and then eventually we will break down the individual choice of law approaches.